So the format, as Ursula said, mentioned, is that we'll give the candidates 5 minutes open discussion to present their view and the positions they would like to express to you. The format for questioning, we've got questions that have come in on environment, on infrastructure, on tourism, on transport, and we've tried to condense those questions down into an hour's worth of questions rather than the 5 that they could have answered for. The candidates, what I would suggest is if there's a topic that you feel that you would like to address directly for the community, you'll have 2 minutes to speak to that point, but remember there'll be other issues, particularly later down the track, so the time that we leave for those more topical issues maybe will facilitate a broader discussion on those issues. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mark Jamieson to give his opening address for us.
I'll time it.
Thanks very much, Brett, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I join with Ursula in recognising the traditional custodians? Thank you all for being here this evening and showing your interest in the 2020 local government elections for the Sunshine Coast. And probably never before have 2 elements been really important about the future of our region and this particular election, and that is about honesty and truth. Confidence, honesty and truth. Since I've taken the role as Mayor now for the last 2 terms, so 7.5 years, we've seen a really important uptick in the confidence of our region. People feel a lot more confident about the future, where we're heading, the opportunities that are presenting themselves. In 2012, post the GFC, many of you of course would recognise that at that time the Sunshine Coast was really on its knees. We had unemployment of almost 12%. The confidence levels were down in terms of investment, and the Sunshine Coast was really struggling. The region had amongst the lowest levels of business confidence of anyone in the state. Since then, we've seen a significant improvement in our economy. We're now getting the infrastructure needs that we so desperately needed, and we really are on the radar with the other 2 levels of government, being the state and federal government. Now, it's important to have the ear of the state and federal government because otherwise you don't get a fair go. Currently, out of this Sunshine Coast region, on an annual basis, the federal government would take somewhere between $5 and $6 billion in taxes. The state government about $1.6 billion in taxes. Sunshine Coast Council, $350 million in rates. Significant differences. And in terms of the big infrastructure we need to be getting a fair share from state and federal governments. Business confidence today is much higher. In fact, the Sunshine Coast Business Confidence Indicator is amongst the highest in the state. And that's good because that ensures there's going to be employment opportunities for people. Our employment is down to 5.6%. That's below the state average, and we've created nearly 25,000 jobs over the last two terms of council. And our employment rate typically has not been below the state average. Normally we were the state average plus 1 or 2%. But as a consequence of the procedures we've put in place and the policies we've put in place around economic development in particular, we're in much better shape. So whilst I've been Mayor, we've seen household incomes increase by 25%. We used to be 22% below the state average. Now we're only about 8% below the state average and eating into that all the time. We're home to some of the nation's most highly recognised and credentialed sustainability project, like our solar farm. We're the only government on mainland Australia that provides an offset for all its own energy. And the new recent announcement around the development of a blue carbon farm on the Maroochy River floodplain that will create opportunities not only for council and community but also for the private landowners there. We're actually taking real action around climate change, not just declaring an emergency and then doing nothing. We've got the largest conservation estate of any council in South East Queensland. We've got the largest land for wildlife program in Australia. We've got our own solar farm. We've got a coastal adaptation strategy in place. And we're making an application to be a UNESCO biosphere, which will give certainty to our community around what I call the synergy between economy, environment and community. Now, all of these things haven't happened by chance. And by the way, we are the only city in the Southern Hemisphere who was recognised last year by the World Intelligent Community Forum as one of the smartest place in the Southern Hemisphere, the most intelligent community. That doesn't happen by chance. It's come as a result of a determined approach by Council to ensure that our region is living up to its expectations and taking every advantage we can. My commitment to the Sunshine Coast has always been about achieving that balance. Having constituents that are happy, people who've got jobs, people can be confident about their children having jobs into the future, but at the same time preserving those environmental elements that are so important to people who live on the Sunshine Coast, and at the same time deal with a whole range of significant community issues: homelessness, child molestation, drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence. That's 5 or 4? 5. Okay, well I'll wrap up there. I can no doubt get back to some of the other points in the questions. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.
We'll now hear from Chris Thompson.
Thanks very much, Brad, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, my background. I realise that I might be new to a lot of people here. So I went to school in Brisbane and finished year 12. I joined the Navy for 6 years. When I left the Navy, I went travelling the world for a couple of years. Came back to Mum and Dad's place here on the Sunshine Coast and was in the first group of students to go through the University of the Sunshine Coast, where I did a Bachelor of Business degree. And then I went on to join the last Maroochy Shire Council in 2004, was then elected to the first Sunshine Coast Council in 2008 and subsequently re-elected again in 2012 until 2016 when I decided to take a break, and I've been doing consulting work in Brisbane since then. A lot of people ask me why I put my hand up to run for Mayor, and there's a couple of really important issues that I need to spell out to you this evening, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about them in the press. The first one is transparency. Transparency in our organisation. It is one of the key fundamental expectations of the community that the council that they deal with and they pay rates to is open and transparent in everything they do. And over the last 4 years, council has drifted away significantly from being open and transparent. I intend to change that. I'm going to lay out a plan for you all this evening, and it's about live streaming all of the council meetings. It's about introducing a new town planning committee meeting that all the communities are invited to all of the time, and everybody will have their say. So that's the first issue. The second issue is really about lifestyle. Over the last few years in particular, people who live in the Central Coastal region have just seen their lifestyle absolutely crushed by traffic and continuous development. And the feedback that I get through engaging with local communities is that they're not seeing any money spent on public transport infrastructure. I'm sure it's no different out here with what you're facing in Beerwah East and all of those types. Those developments are coming at 100 miles an hour. We need to be on the front foot. We need to be putting in infrastructure first before all of these developments are allowed to continue. That's really important to the lifestyle of the people on the Sunshine Coast. And the Mayor is right. I mean, people choose to live in the hinterland for a reason. They enjoy a quieter lifestyle and they don't want to have that overrun by new developments, new units, new suburbs coming around them with no infrastructure in place to support those developments. So that's the second thing. One of the other key things that we've really got to fight against is our economy focusing solely on urban development for its growth. When I was in council, I was a big advocate for a diverse economic base. So that included things like the airport, aeronautical industries, which unfortunately, again, with the change in the master plan at the airport, the council's pretty quickly taken away aviation spaces and aviation industry spaces from tenants at the airport, jumped straight into a property development outcome, putting up a McDonald's where Previously, I'd stood on that site with the Deputy Premier of Queensland, accepted it and said we were going to build an aviation precinct there. Now it's going to be a McDonald's. So they're the types of things that I'll be fighting for. A diverse economic base, lifestyle of the constituents must come first, and engaging with all the communities. Sure, I've got academic qualifications, also got a master's degree from the University of Queensland. I've got 12 years experience in council, which time, that whole time I was the head of finance governance committees. So I know how the budget works, I know how to address the debt, I know how to do financial sustainability plans. I've got all that, but the biggest thing I bring to the table is a common sense approach and the ability to listen to our individual communities. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, sorry. You'll get the extra time. Yeah, well, I first fell in love with the coast about 36 years ago in '84 when I first set foot here. And to me then, it was a paradise, and it still is a paradise, and one worth preserving for the people here now, for their kids and for kids' kids and forever. The coast has a unique opportunity to be a place to which not only do the locals enjoy it, but also tourists will come here, because as the world becomes increasingly populated by megacities, we will be appreciated as a place of space where economic development has been integrated. Sorry, are you frowning? No. Has been integrated with lifestyle and a regeneration of the environment. They will appreciate us as a community that didn't settle simply for an overbuilt strip along the beachfront that it seems like the current council wants to create here. That beyond that beachfront, there'll be absolutely no proper development other than just along that coastal strip. Our incomparable combination of climate, of rivers, ocean, hinterland, is an unparalleled natural gift our community has been given, and one that we should preserve and share with the world. I believe the coast should be a panorama of ecotourism, deluxe farm stays, surf lodges, training institutions of all kind, and other places where people can have experience holidays, not just come here to lie on a 2-star bed in a place that calls itself a 5-star resort. Sorry. The radio announcer's instructing me. The young, well-heeled traveller or retiree doesn't come to a place that offers, as I said, a lie on a beach followed by a lie on a 2-star bed in something that calls itself a 5-star resort. The secret of success in tourism is that your guests stay a long time, they spend a lot of money, and this will only happen if we offer them a great many things to do and also things to be entertained by. It's not happening at the moment. We have close to the worst tourist figures of any tourist destination on the coast in Australia. We only maintain some respectability by adding Noosa's figures to ours. And as for the employment figures, well, the current employment figures are slightly different from the ones that Council offers, because the Australian Bureau of Statistics says it's about 6.08%. So, you know, we're in a position to not only offer a holiday here on the coast, but also, you know, we could package it with a week skiing in New Zealand, because we're so close to the skiing in New Zealand. They come here for a month, they take a week and go to New Zealand. So there's unique opportunities that this coast has that almost nobody else in the world has. But I believe that we have this great opportunity. But as everyone has spoken of honesty and transparency, and it is an issue that apparently will occupy a lot of talk during this election. I intend to lobby, as should I be elected mayor, to have a permanent citizens committee in place that meets once a month and can call any of the local government elected councillors or staff to come and share their information with the community and also share the information the community has. I don't think we can continue to tolerate a government that wishes to keep the community in the dark. I don't think we can continue to tolerate a government that only says it needs to know and it knows best. The 200 secret meetings that were held by this council during its last 2 terms were conducted almost entirely about property speculation and their profits. It had nothing to do with creating industry on the coast or anything else. So I will promise as mayor, not just to promise transparency, but also embed it into the council so it will be there for all times. The creation of...
We've got 5 minutes and then... So finally, Tom, thank you.
Oh, thank you. G'day, how are you? Okay. If you want to do something such as this, there's a number of things that arise immediately. If you want to come to a meeting such as this, you have to have something to say. And it's an important proposition. Not rhetoric, not spin, not dogma or doctrine, but rather simply the opportunity to come to a group of people, present yourself and say, look, I can do a job here and I'm asking you to support me in the opportunity to do it. That's it. That's what we're here for. Everybody's here to have the opportunity to be able to present themselves and to offer themselves as a viable proposition. So I put myself forward because I'm passionate about a number of things. But I particularly put myself forward because what I'm after is a campaign of ideas and engagement. What I'm not after is this oddity that we've got developing already, where the incumbent mayor is taken to be the pariah and the target for which we will all attack. It seems to me extraordinarily strange that so many of the people who are already campaigning and already sloganeering are doing it on the basis of a time for change. And that seems to me to be that they are clearly and openly stating that they want his removal. All right, now that's kind of a hard thing to get your head around. How does somebody who is an incumbent, who's done the job for 8 years, how does he become a pariah? And why is it that we others are here putting in our job application to take his place? Well, we are because there's been some things that have been unpalatable and that have really quite gone wrong. We all have to, much as this community sees itself as somewhat distant from it, we all have to reflect very carefully on the financial catastrophe that the CBD represents. And it is a very real catastrophe, okay, in the many, many millions of dollars. And precisely the sort of thing that did to Ipswich is about to happen to us. Those people found themselves with a $78 million hole out of their corporate development entity that was set up to develop them a lovely new CBD. And now, as I understand it, their rates are going to go up between 40 and 50%. Now, if you really want that, then this is who you vote for, because it's going to be more of the same. Or in my mind, for example, callous as it might seem, if you vote for Chris, I reckon it's going to be same horse, different jockey. Okay, I reckon it's just going to be exactly the same caper. I really don't see a change. I'm sorry, I can't. I've watched and I've been involved in politics. Chris knows that. I ran against him in 2004 and I finished very close second to him. All right, and I'm going to do better than that this time. Rest assured, because people are going to find out about passion. They're going to find out about somebody who's willing to dig in and find all of the stuff that we really should be being made clear, or the business with the secret meetings with the CEO's contract being renewed 2 years ahead of time, or the secret meetings over public health. I mean, get that, the airport, you've got toxicity, and we've got secret meetings, keeping those very grave issues of public health from the people. And they approved it. He sat there, I presume went into private session and came up with a reason why it should be kept from us. How is that a rational proposition, that you've got an issue of quite serious public health being discussed behind closed doors? I just don't get it. That alludes to the transparency issue that the other two candidates have put forward and the prior doesn't want to talk about. So that's 1 minute to go, okay. I'm also terribly passionate about residents' rights, and I can very quickly tell you that one of the things that I will be campaigning on, and you people that live in this community are definitely going to get a lot of information about it, because this is where my business operates, and you will see it in your letterboxes every week, and that is, I need to see a complete overhaul of the dangerous local laws that we've had passed. One of them in particular is verge policy, again a champion from Mark Jamieson, and it is without a shadow of a doubt one of the most dangerous pieces of policy you people have ever had the misfortune to not read. You're going to discover that, for example, council suggests that if you've got a gravel driveway, you're going to have to get a permit for it. All right, because it cannot be classified as something that is allowable under the verge garden policy. It's in fact outside it, and they say that you're going to have to apply for a permit for it. Why? Because loose rocks are prohibited and it traverses the footpath. So there you go.
Okay, our first round of questioning for this evening will cover areas that have been submitted in questions relating to the environment. These questions have substantially been taken from you as the community, and the ordering will be, we've got 2 minutes to provide a response to the questions. Some of the questions have multiple parts to them, so the area that you think is most relevant. Ursula, if you could give a bell at 2 minutes, maybe to wrap up within 2.5 minutes. So that will work well. So the first question on the environment, and specifically landfill. So what more do you plan to do to stop more going into landfill? Have you given this any thought? Are you willing to invest time and money to evaluate possibilities to reduce and eventually eliminate our rubbish dumps? Are you willing to evaluate and investigate other ways that other countries are treating their rubbish, for example, Sweden, Denmark and Switzerland? Where would you start? And would you agree to have landfill eliminated within 10 years? I'll open it to the floor for comment.
Hi, thanks, Brett. So in terms of landfill, I think it's pretty widely known in the community that landfill space is really at a premium right now, and we've actively been looking for more landfill sites for many, many years. I think it was back in the Bob Abbott Council that we first introduced a strategy which was designed to minimise waste going to landfill, and in fact had some really ambitious targets going to, in fact spoke about in the future sometime zero waste to landfill. So there's been a lot of investigations, a lot of work done in this area. The couple of solutions that have come through over a long period of time. Firstly, we on the Sunshine Coast won't solve this problem by ourselves. We need to work with Moreton Bay Regional Council and Noosa Council and find a whole of region solution for it. And they will be things like waste to energy, which happens in cities like Singapore, a lot of cities in Europe. So there's those opportunities. There's also a lot of economic opportunities in recycling. But as we've seen lately, Australia's shipping a lot of its recycling material overseas, not processing it here in Australia and providing those jobs. So certainly I would commit any council that I lead to try and minimise any waste going to landfill. with a really aggressive zero to waste landfill targets where we can achieve them, increase the recycling capacity, and look to work with our neighbouring councils on a regional solution to it.
Thanks, Chris. Any other comments? Michael?
Thank you. Look, there was already a lot of work being done working with the other councils in South East Queensland. It makes sense for councils to work together in this area. Clearly the big wake-up call has been the decision by China not to take recycled materials from Australia, and that was done for a variety of reasons. So, but I think it's what's most important is that we take responsibility for our own waste, and we find ways to reutilise it through waste to energy perhaps, or indeed using waste for a whole lot of other ingenious, innovative ways, building roads, building bridges, building all sorts of equipment, bollards for instance. What's important is council also becomes a customer and is prepared to buy back those products from the industries that develop them. Otherwise all we're doing is carting the waste and moving it to another area and giving someone else the responsibility of dealing with it in the long run. It is a serious problem. And it's a serious problem that our community needs to spend a lot more time understanding. We are a bit laissez-faire in a lot of communities around the amount of waste. Having said that, I can remember growing up as a small boy when all we had was a 50-litre bin. At my place today there are 3 240-litre bins, recycling general waste and green waste. And I think that's a responsible approach to have, but it demonstrates how much more waste we're generating. We're a very consumer-driven society. So waste to energy is a big element for the future, and the LGAQ has already put a target on no more landfill, and that is 2040. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Don or Michael?
G'day. My business is a small-scale recycling, where I recycle about a tonne of green waste a month. Yeah, I recycle it into worm farms and composting generally. So there is a great deal of waste. In fact, I think we shouldn't call it waste. We should call it resource, because there, as the Mayor was saying, there are a great many products that can now be produced from plastic, like bollards, as you said, and also there's now enzymes that can eat certain types of waste and secrete useful products that can be used as fertiliser. So we should stop thinking of it as waste, but really we should think of it as a resource. And each town, in fact, I have an idea that, like Tidy Town, a town should become a recycle town, where they have a capacity to recycle the waste within a town to some close facility that they can that much of this waste can be then turned into purposeful products. So, as I say, waste should be thought of as resources, not as waste, and then we have to come up with concepts how to mine that resource, just like we mine all resources.
Thank you, Michael. Don?
So thank you for this question, Ursula. You had 4 dot points there, and I'll quickly bang onto them and then go to a general. In relation to your thoughts, eliminating seems unlikely as a current answer. That's just the bottom line. And Mark's suggestion of a 2040 deadline to be aiming for is something that, it might seem that that's a bit long too, but at least it's a realistic and already achievable timeline. In relation to evaluating internationally, of course, unquestionably, but done with common sense, simply on the internet and Skype, rather than sending delegations over there to find out about rubbish. We realistically do it within our economic constraints here and get a worthwhile outcome from it. In relation to how you would start, of course, this ball got well and truly rolling with a huge ball of plastic by the war on waste, the Chasers' war on waste. And community sentiment changed the moment that happened. So this is already on a roll, and all we need to do is engage and see people invest in it themselves, because they see no reason. Underneath my cupboard is already full of soft plastics. I've already got all of my cans and metal lids separated into plastic and metal. Because why? Because we're saving all our 10 senses now. We are already on this roller coaster of recycle engagement. But I have a couple of ideas. Firstly, I'd like to make green bins free. Okay, so there you go. And I'd like to go find a way to make that happen and to get the resource that is in those green bins and turn it to something profitable. And if you want an idea of how out of touch our council is with its planning, think on this simple fact. All right, green bins come fortnightly. So why would you only get a fortnightly pickup in summer when you grow all your grass, and a fortnightly pickup in winter when none grows? How simple is that? Where's the rationale behind that thinking? Surely if you wanted a green bin, you'd every week in summer, every 3 to 4 weeks in winter. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. So the next topic of questioning goes to conservation of our local treasures, and I guess it's a specific question, but it's a broader application for environmental treasures in the area. So the question is, would you consider closing the climbing of Tibbergargan, Nungan and Mount Beerwah for staggered periods of time to let mountains regenerate? As a local, the mountains are being ruined by too much human traffic. I believe they need to be managed or they will be destroyed. Mark?
Look, well, neither did I, Don, if it makes you feel any better. In fact, I didn't get any questions, so you've got a head start there. Look, again, we're mixing local government decisions with state government decisions. This is not a decision for the local government. And whilst we can have an opinion, the reality is the national parks are controlled by the state. I mean, my wife and I always lament seeing valuable resources picking people up off the mountains and thinking what a waste of resource that our community has worked hard to build up, only to see it get wasted. But then again, there are lots of responsible people who climb the mountains and do it effectively and don't get themselves into trouble. So, and you could argue it's like people going to the beach. Some manage to enjoy a day without getting into any trouble, and some, for other reasons, always seem to be getting dragged out by the surf lifesavers. You know, it's the sort of world we live in. But, you know, I think we should have a certain amount of respect for our traditional owners, but it's not something that's high on my agenda presently. I'm much more interested in focusing around the UNESCO biosphere, which will also create great opportunities for our traditional owners and the potential for Indigenous tourism into the future, but also, you know, that authentic Indigenous experience that will come from a new international airport where our Indigenous people can show their culture, their tucker, their bush tucker, the music, song and art. So that would be my answer.
Any other points to make on that question? Okay.
Just to touch on it, keep in mind.
Speak up then.
Speaking of, so we're speaking as a generality here of protection and finding a way to, at the same time as offer the protection, also give to the community from such a wonderful asset like the Glasshouse Mountains. I had a quick idea that I think is something that could be turned into a real positive for the area. And that is, I'd like to see the council work with the Indigenous peoples of the Glasshouse hinterland and establish a black swan breeding program at Ewan Maggot Dam. Now, I say that firstly because it's on Steve Irwin Way, secondly because it's in proximity to Twinnies, as well as to the hospital at Steve Irwin Way. I see the opportunity that is there to work with SEQ Water. There is already council facilities on one side of it, so I can't find any negatives in it. I would be quite prepared to write to the Premier of Western Australia because they've got such enormous flocks of them over there as compared to us, which really does grate on me greatly. Here we are, our namesake bird, and we have no organised structure to bring it to be the asset that it could be, just like the Glasshouse Mountains. Okay, I could see it as an adjunct and something that would be particularly beneficial working in concert with the Indigenous. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to a question relating to protection of flora and fauna, and this is in the context of estimates of population growth in the Sunshine Coast. So the question, or the statement is, the coastal strip is reaching its capacity. Already we have seen densely compacted housing estates such as Aura, Harmony, Palmview, and soon BR East. The questions to be addressed: do you believe our hinterland towns are different from the coastal urban areas? If so, how do you think they are different? How would you ensure the protection of the environment and character of the towns of Glasshouse Country and the hinterland? And how would you manage population growth and development in the Sunshine Coast, understanding that that might also be a state and federal question?
Well, as I said in my introductory speech, the coast is a place for space, and part of that space must be that it's occupied by native flora and fauna, because essentially we will not have the tourism that we should have without native flora and fauna. If you look at the recent bushfires, if you look at overseas press coverage, what did they cover? They didn't cover whether or not a five-star hotel burned down somewhere. What they covered was what was happening to the koalas. So all the interest from overseas travellers is about koalas or kangaroos. It's not about whether or not we have a five-star hotel down on the beach. People will come here to enjoy our space and enjoy the animals and the flora within it. So unless we protect it, we're not protecting the thing that is our most valuable asset. And they say the koala is, I think it's worth $3.5 billion to the Australian economy. Well, the koala is worth a similar or a proportional amount to our economy. And things like what happened down at Pelican Waters, where the whole mob of kangaroos was virtually wiped out because the big males were shot, and the rest of the mob was transferred to some place where, of course, they're probably incompatible with their lifestyle. And of course, they had no big males to protect them, so they became victims of the wild dogs and whatever else predates on kangaroos. So, without native flora and fauna, we have very little to offer people. You know, young, well-heeled travellers don't come to a space anymore because they can stay in they can lie on a 2-star bed in a place called a 5-star resort. What they come for is activities. You know, they want to do bike trails, they want to do paragliding, they want to do lots of things. They don't want to lie on a bed or lie on a beach and then go in and lie on a bed. They want activities. And these are the people that our future relies on, or our tourist future relies on. It doesn't rely on this mythical idea that there's a 1955-star tourist that wants to come to a 5-star resort on the coast. They don't. You know, the young people want activities. They don't want to. And also the fact that most of our tourists only stay 3 days indicates to us that there isn't enough to occupy them here. You know, we want them to stay for 3 weeks, not 3 days, because they don't spend enough money. And so, is that me? Go on.
Yep.
Thanks, Brett. I know the question was really twofold. The first one is about the uniqueness of our hinterland communities. My vision for the Sunshine Coast is that we continue to be a community of communities. So each of our hinterland towns in particular has a unique identity, and you have a unique experience when you visit those hinterland towns. From someone who lives in a highly densely populated area of the Sunshine Coast, I feel that we really need to have these spaces where we can jump in our car, drive north over the Maroochy River and feel like we're in another world. Similarly, we can just drive out here half an hour and again we can feel like we're in the countryside, enjoy the beautiful environment, visit the hinterland towns and spend some money there. How we achieve this is a couple of things. Firstly, the planning scheme needs to be strengthened, the provisions around the urban footprint in particular, so that we don't have our hinterland towns bleeding into another one, so it just becomes one homogenous blob of urban sprawl. And if we let that continue, we'll end up all the way to Caboolture North. So that's one of the key important drivers for me, is to tighten the urban footprint around our hinterland towns. And the second point I'd like to raise is that we really need to implement a rail town master plan, so we have resources going into each of the rail towns that we have on the Sunshine Coast and making sure that their unique identities are protected into the future, particularly with the expansion of the rail, and I would hope to see the duplication all the way to Nambour in the near future. But all of that just adds more pressure to each of our local communities. So that's the first point. The second one around the environment, of course we need to protect it. I think Michael's right. The most valuable experience that tourists have is engaging with our natural environment, and whether you like them or not, that's why Noosa have been so strong for decades, because they're very confident about saying, you know, we don't have a lot of development in Noosa and that's okay. We have a beautiful environment that people like to come and visit.
Mike? Just bear in mind we have a question on transport coming up.
Is that a warning? Look, again, the facts and the truth is important here. There's some statements being made that, you know, I think are absolute folly. The reality is the Sunshine Coast is 2,500 square kilometres of land. Only 15% is earmarked for urban development. Only 15%. And that includes Aura, Palmview, the city centre, and other developments around the place. And I'm happy to go on record here tonight and saying that I will be arguing vehemently with the state government that we don't need to increase that 15%. There are opportunities for further development on the Sunshine Coast, there's no doubt about that. If we want to have an effective mass transit system on the Sunshine Coast, we're going to need to see increased density, not necessarily high rise, certainly not Gold Coast high rise, but increased density along that route, which would be principally along Nicklin Way. But I just make that point. And areas like Aura, which is earmarked for about 50,000 people, Beerwah East another 50,000 people, Palmview 20,000 people, and I'd make the point that Palmview and Beerwah East, Palmview and Aura were approved by effectively the state government. Those of you who remember, council prior to me opposed the expansion of Aura, or Caloundra South as it was called, but the state government overrode that. So, you know, they're the challenges you come up against. It's easy to have these grand ideas and visions, but sometimes much more difficult to deliver. The other point I'd make is, generally the hinterland areas have had a 100-year start on the coastal area. But you can't ignore the fact that that's where the population is moving to. And I get it. There are people who love living in the hinterland and there are people who love living on the coastline. We've got to cater for them all. The fact of the matter is there is more of them down there on the coast. But so I really do believe that there's an opportunity for us to position ourselves well into the future by not extending that 15% into the future. Thank you.
Okay, just quickly, the points are, again, they're dot points there. It's noted that the coastal street is reaching its capacity marks.
Use the microphone.
You sure? Okay. No worries. There you go. It's noted, and I thank Mark for saying it too, pointing out that the actual relative figures of the 2,500 square kilometres and what small proportion of it is actually being developed. And so in reality, whilst anecdotally we may feel that it's reaching its capacity, the truth is not really. The truth is that it does still hold a capacity for more urbanisation. I would point out, small point, Palmview Forest definitely isn't densely compacted. It's a acreage estate, and in fact it's quite a lovely development as well. I can assure you, a lot of fabulous properties in there. Aura and Harmony, however, are at the other end of the scale, unquestionably. Beerwah East is still a dream currently, and would look, based on demand, to be some way off. So, you know, as a realistic consideration, I don't think you would be sweating the big ones on that too much at the moment. Railway towns have always had their own character. That's precisely one of the things that defines them, because they're a railway town. Oddly enough, you go to the Brisbane city and you will see that there are railway towns, only they're suburbs, and they are stops next to each other. But they do have a defined character, and that's always going to be the case out here until such time as there is infill stations in the gaps in between. Each of the 4 railway postcodes has its own wonderful separation. Diamond Valley and all the way through to Tunnel Ridge Road defines all of Malula. Landsborough is defined by Dull Archer and Forestry Road. Beerwah is defined by Roy's Road and by the bum of Peachester. Each of them has its own character precisely because of that delineation. That'll do. Oh, well, honour it. There you go. You're welcome.
Thank you.
I've got to work tomorrow.
Okay, so moving on to broader question of transport. So general questions from the floor. We would like to be updated on transport, rail and growth, please. We understand that state and federal government's investment in road and rail, but would like the Sunshine Coast, the council's position. Bearing in mind that the Queensland government has significant control over residential development and transport, how can council really make a difference, is the question.
Well, I'll have to start. Look, I think the Local Government Act says that council must lobby on behalf of its community. That's one of the most important roles we've got. Despite that small sliver of money we get from the taxation system, our big job is how we can influence on behalf of our communities, state and federal politicians. And I've got to tell you, they've been dragging their feet in terms of public transport and transport generally on the Sunshine Coast. I mean, the Bruce Highway has needed upgrading for donkey's ages. The rail line from Brisbane to Nambour is a single line beyond Beerwah. You know, it is the biggest choke point in the whole network. Why have we been treated so poorly in this region? Very good question to ask. What am I doing about it? Well, I've got the ear of the state government and the federal government about how important getting rail through the Sunshine Coast, in fact all the way to Bundaberg, will be into the future. And also, not only do we need a city-to-city connection, i.e. from Brisbane to the city of Maroochydore and Nambour, but we also need a suburb-to-suburb opportunity if we're going to move people along the coastal strip via a mass transit system. And the Sunshine Coast Council has put $7.5 million, and we've got $7.5 million from the state government, so a total of 15, to complete a detailed business case about how we will move people into the future. Because there's no doubt with the future growth targets that we have, you know, we're going to come very heavily congested if we don't give people viable alternatives around transport. And we'll look at all options as far as the mass transit is concerned. Clearly, Ted O'Brien, the member for Fairfax, is very focused on delivering fast rail, and that'd be great for all these communities, from Brisbane through to Nambour. If you could take that trip in under an hour, that'd be fantastic. It has some tricks with it as well, because if you're travelling that distance in an hour, there are not too many stops. So think of the stops you do have and the sort of car parks you're going to need to service those stops. So a few challenges in amongst that. Thank you.
Yes, well, I believe the most important bit of infrastructure we can do is the duplication of the rail between Brisbane and Nambour. I believe it's more important than the widening of the Bruce. But I also believe that, you know, if we're looking at transport, you know, everyone talks about the 30-minute cities, but what we're now looking at is 30-minute suburbs, because we've created such gridlocks within our suburbs that you can't get out of them in less than 30 minutes. I mean, Sippy Downs is a typical example. You know, there's gridlock there every morning, every afternoon. And now they're funneling traffic from Harmony into Sippy Downs because there's virtually only one road out of Sippy Downs, out of Harmony. So I see transport, that transport needs a whole new model for, a whole new modelling to, because what we're not acknowledging is these suburbs now have multiple simultaneous developments that are not being taken accounted for. I mean, I've read traffic reports, and only somebody with a lot of time on their hands can do that, that tell me that all they do is count the number of car parks in a development. And then, you know, once you get out the driveway, you're on your own, because nobody cares about what accumulation of traffic there is on the road caused by a number of simultaneous developments. And you know, we're getting developments down on the ocean front that are on a single one lane road that involve an extra 200 or 300 cars. So, you know, in my view, there's no real proper modelling of what's happening in the suburbs. So as I say, I believe in the duplication of the rail from Brisbane to Nambour, and I think that's the most important piece of infrastructure we can do, not just for transporting people, but also for transporting freight. Okay.
Thanks, Brett. This really demonstrates a clear lack of common sense approach to town planning. So what we've got is a council continuing to advocate for greater infill and greater densities along the coastal strip that is at congestion now, right now, today. So how do we force the state government's hand in providing more bus services, more public transport options for our residents? We tell the state government, you know what, we've more than exceeded your growth population targets. According to Development Watch, we're 25% over any targets they've already set for us. So we say we're going to put infill developments like this on hold until the public transport infrastructure is rolled out. You know, it's about the lifestyle the Sunshine Coast people once enjoyed, and it's being crushed. So we've got to really force the state government to come on board and start delivering this public transport. I agree with Michael. One of the biggest infrastructure projects we can get to move the coast along is in fact the duplication of the rail all the way to Nambour. I'm a strong advocate for that, and I'll be meeting with the state government representatives on that if I'm successful in really pushing it along. The second way that council can force the hand is to put some money on the table in terms, I know Mark said they're putting in some money for the business case for the light rail and mass transport systems, but they can make a difference tomorrow by putting some of the transport levy that everybody pays into the land use planning, things like, you know, better bus stops, more frequency of buses, and advocating for a much broader range of transport services, particularly for the hinterland area. So whether it's funding initial trials or that sort of thing, to prove that these public transport linkages will be viable into the future.
Key component of the solution to the question revolves around a fairer share of the available funds. It's not a notional idea in terms of, and it's understood by everybody here, we have a system whereby people are elected based on proportional representation. It's a rather simple concept based around numbers. So if you follow that through, then you will come up with a proportional collection of funds. And those funds can be broken down into funds that are collected by the federal government, funds that are collected by the state government, and funds that are collected by the council through its rates and other charges. So it beggars belief to me that based on populace and simple numbers, that revenue doesn't come to us proportionally commensurate with those same proportions. What we're discussing here is a shortfall as compared to what is collected from us. It's quite simple. These things that we crave and or need or desire can be made available to us. These expansions of roads, these improvements of rail networks can be made available to us if we simply advocate better at the right levels for our fairer proportion of the money that is collected that should come back to us. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll move along to the topic of commerce and their local economy. So the question is, so far the major region-making projects delivered by Council have all appeared to be located on the coast. In the next round of major projects, do you agree that it is the time for some serious investment in the hinterland? And I would ask the question, what might that look like?
I might go last this time.
So, could you repeat the question?
So the question is, so far the major region-making projects delivered by Council have been all located on the coast. In the next round of major projects, do you agree that it's time for serious investment in the hinterland? And I guess the follow-on question is that what investment would that look like?
These major investment opportunities in infrastructure projects that happen on the coast have been on the books for about 20 years or more. So there was a really long lead time to a lot of these projects. So for instance, the Sunshine Coast Airport, that's been around since the 70s. The CBD was a relatively new phenomenon that came around during the Bob Abbott Council era when Babcock and Brown actually wanted to buy the golf course off the members. And so, and Babcock and Brown, they fell over during the GFC. So the Abbott Council stepped in and purchased the Horton Park golf course, and the rest is history, as we know. So the next big infrastructure projects, I think, on the hinterland will be the duplication of rail, and that'll open up some economic opportunities for people here. One of the really important things that I think we need to focus on in our economic development strategy is to do scale up, not start up. In the past, Council has spent a disproportionate amount of money, in my view, on startups. You know, go back a couple of years and startups was a buzzword and everybody was throwing money at them because they were all looking for the next Google or the next Microsoft, and you know, they wanted them based on the Sunshine Coast, and they wanted to you know, provide an incubator for that. That's all fine, but unless we're looking after our local businesses and helping them to scale up so they can employ more people, then we're really wasting a lot of money. So that's where I stand. I think the rail will be a catalyst for the hinterland for that, and I'd like to see Council refocus its economic development strategy on scale up instead of start up.
Well, my understanding is the next big infrastructure project is going to be the 1.5 billion the council wants to spend on a light rail between Maroochydore and Caloundra. So after that, there won't be a lot of money left for infrastructure anywhere. So I can't see that, well, personally, I don't believe that that'll serve much purpose, because, you know, if putting light rail between Caloundra and Maroochydore is a bit like a family with 3 kids buying a 2-seater Lotus. You know, it's all very well having an infrastructure that can transport 20,000 people between Caloundra and Maroochydore in an hour, but are we ever going to need to transport 20,000 people between Maroochydore? But we, you know, it just won't happen. So what we need is a transit way between those 2 points that can be used by a variety of different vehicles, including trackless trams and buses, and it can be used by different vehicles at different times. I mean, during peak hour it's all buses, during off-peak hours it's Uber cars and taxis and buses. And also, transit ways can connect the hinterland to the coast. But if there's no money left, because $1.5 billion has been put into the light rail, well, that won't happen. So I think it deserves, the hinterland deserves to have transit ways and as good a public transport as they want to put a Ferrari on the coast, but they don't want to give anything. But they don't want to give any access or improved access to the hinterland, and I think that's wrong because the money should be spread around more. Okay.
Don?
I had the advantage of access to some of the questions, but these are ones that I didn't, so I'll fly blind on it. But I'm struck by, in relation to timelines and achieving better things for this community, I was struck by a picture that I saw in the paper last week, and it was of John Connolly speaking about the commencement of a walkway along Alexander Headlands that's going to link there to Mooloolaba. And I noted it in the script of what was written that it was a project that was started in 2015. And I think to myself, he was standing beside an announcement of $2 million. And it took 5 years to get it to that point. Okay, I think we are hamstrung by bureaucracy. I seriously believe that it needs the biggest broom you can imagine pushed through that bureaucracy, and that with that will become the acceleration of the projects that you see and wish to see. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I guess, you know, we're always going to get some strange views. The responsibility for public transport on the Sunshine Coast does not rest with the Sunshine Coast Council. I made that point earlier. Sunshine Coast Council is not spending $1.5 billion on a light rail network. That belongs to the state government. That's what you pay your taxes to them for. Just as you pay your taxes to them for the upgrade of the North Coast Rail Line, which the federal government has finally recognised as a nation-building project as well, and has decided they're prepared to make a commitment to it. But as I said before, as a mayor representing or leading a council representing our community, our job is to advocate as fearlessly as we can to the state government. Back to the question. The council rates generates 24% of our total rate income comes from the hinterland, divisions 1, 5 and 10. But 29% of the capital expenditure goes back into those areas. So it's not a case of the hinterlands always being ripped off. I mean, the fact of the matter is there are significantly larger numbers of people on the coast that need to be catered for. There's incredible infrastructure here. Some of it's pretty old and tired, like the railway line. And if we think warring between ourselves is going to be a solution to our problems, we've got no chance of getting the state on side. So we've got to continue to work really hard about that. Rightfully, things like the airport will be a huge boom for tourism right across the coast, even to our neighbouring areas. The opportunity to have fresh produce freighted out of the Sunshine Coast Airport into key Asian markets at a high premium price, that should put a smile on the face of our farmers and growers. The work we're doing around the international broadband submarine cable. I mean, it comes ashore at Maroochydore, but the connectivity will be available all the way across the coast. And again, the notion that we can be selling high quality produce into Asian markets using blockchain technology to show the provenance of the food, i.e. where it came from, what it was eating, how it was slaughtered, that will generate a much higher price in the eyes of keen people in major Chinese cities. So there's big opportunities there. We've got to make sure we share those around.
Development and investment in the local area. So a number of questions related to businesses that are wishing to make significant investment in Beerwah and surrounding areas, needing certainty as to the future direction and area and growth of this area. What are your views on population growth in this local area? And I guess it comes from the context that if there's no certainty as to population growth and driving of the local economy, then it's really limiting the potential for private capital investment in the area.
Well, there's a lot of concentration on the simple fact that we're going to have the population's going to keep growing. Unfortunately, the state has a lot of control over that. If they sell a cheap pine forest to a developer, then of course the developer builds cheap houses, and through a mechanism of social engineering, people move here because they're offered cheap rent or cheap houses to occupy. But there is no real, I mean, the Mayor speaks of shipping fresh produce to Asia, but there's been no attempt to set up any marketing program to sell anything to anyone. So, you know, the council constantly talks of the fact that they're building something, they're building capacity, but there's no marketing to go along with it. You know, it's this concept of build it and they will come. But that isn't true. That was a quote from a fantasy movie about a guy that built a baseball field for a particular ghost of a particular baseball player to come. You know, it's not a real world thing. I mean, we're building stuff. We're building an airport and we're told tourists will come. Where will they come from? I mean, the trend over the next few years will be that aircraft will get smaller. They won't get bigger. Because, you know, in 10 years there'll be a 6-seater autonomous aircraft flying from Brisbane to here, and it won't have a pilot. You know, so we should be working on the basis of creating an industry here for the aviation that is training people to service the thousands of smaller aircraft that will be in the air in the future, drones and autonomous passenger planes. You know, the idea that we're going to get large planes from Frankfurt with 10 passengers is just not, it's a fantasy. It won't happen. You know, we've got a cable that comes ashore, but then we need tens of millions of more equipment on shore how does it get from here to the hinterland? I mean, who's going to build a cable up here? Who's going to finance it? It's just a fantasy that based on this, build it and they will come. But it's not. There's no real world circumstances under which these ideas the council puts forward are going to happen or become actualised.
Any other comments, Don?
So this is a question around growth, helping to drive demand in terms of you know, construction and retail expansion. And there's a simple proposition. You have two ways that it can be achieved. One of them is organic, via just natural population increase. Having more children be born than people pass away in your area. And I presume that given the vibrancy of the 4 individual railway towns that represent this area that we're talking about, that is something that's ongoing and we're seeing it. But if we are after something else over and above that natural incremental growth of populace to then drive demand, then you have to apply some other thinking to that. You can't just hope that people will have 2 kids or 3 kids or 4 kids. Rather, you need to think about what there is about the independent, individual and desirable aspects of each of these areas that can be used to draw people to come to it. And then from that comes the growth that you require that will then drive the expansion in retail, the expansion in other facilities, purely and simply because you achieved growth.
I am a strong supporter in the natural population growth that we have already. I would much rather see a slower, steadier population growth on the coast than, you know, allowing acres and acres of land to be released and inviting another 50,000 people to come here over a couple of year period. And the reason I say that is because when we have a slower, steadier population growth, we have the ability to provide all of the infrastructure that they need. I know the residents of Aura have had all sorts of trouble with law and order and all that sort of thing because they haven't had a police station there yet. So they're experiencing a lot of problems, not just with things you'd expect to be in new estates, and the lack of public transport is a real telling issue. We need to be a learning organisation and learning through our communities about what's worked and what hasn't worked. So for me, it's a much slower, much steadier population growth. It gives us an opportunity to provide public transport infrastructure as well as the other infrastructure from the state government, such as police stations, schools, and eventually some more employment opportunities. You've got to remember, folks, that it was only since the early 2000s that population of Australia has really taken off. And first we've seen it manifest itself by the crush in the cities. You know, you always hear stories about Sydney and Melbourne building more railway lines, building this, building that, people being stuck in traffic. What happens then is you get a bleed of population to Brisbane City. They're now experiencing the same problem. Congestion is out of control, and inevitably that leads into the region, so the Gold Coast and eventually the Sunshine Coast and further afield. So we need to really manage our population well, and we need to do that through incentive, through things like the planning scheme and the State Planning Act as well.
I'm sure many people in this room have been around for a long time, and the growth of this region has been pretty consistent. Yes, there have been slower periods when we've had economic downturns and people didn't have jobs and they packed up and went away somewhere else. You know, the reality is that the economy always works in cycles. There are good periods and there are bad periods. We should make the most of the good opportunities and then batten down the hatches for the bad opportunities. What we've sought to do as a council is stop having those big hills and hollers and try and level it out by having a stronger focus on a range of industries. In this Glasshouse Mountains area, there are a lot of people, in the hinterland generally, there are a lot of people who work in the trade sector. Plumbers, carpenters, electricians, you know, they want to see work opportunities. They're the people that have got young families. You just can't artificially say we're going to slow it down. It'll slow down itself as the boom comes off. And then it'll come again into the future. So, you know, rather than being surprised when the people arrive, I'd much rather see us have a plan as to how we deal with them. The sort of industries in which they're going to be able to work. I mean, there's no point criticising the likes of Aura and Palm View around small lots. When the reality is that's what a lot of people want these days. People don't want to live on an acre or a quarter of an acre. They don't even want to have a lawnmower or a whippersnipper. You know, so trying to cater for those. There's a lot of people who are just single people. There's a lot of single parents with children, you know, who don't want those sort of responsibilities. So that's why those communities have got to be developed and developed with good communal park facilities. And I think I mean, people are voting with their feet to buy into those communities because they see a future for themselves there. I don't think that's for us to criticise. I mean, the major developers spend a fair bit of time trying to understand what it is that markets want and how that can be provided for them. The other point I would make, particularly in relation to the hinterland, is that, you know, this is a different community. This is a different communal structure. The work council has done in trying to secure the interurban break, that area between Bells Creek Road and Alimba, in a joint arrangement between the Sunshine Coast Council and Moreton Bay Council, east to the Pumice-Stone Passage and Bribie Island, west to the Glasshouse Mountains. I mean, that is an outstanding area to be protected. Obviously, continuing use rights around farming and forestry would need to continue, and they're vital as part of that. But we don't want to see that developed into the future. We don't want to be like the Gold Coast, where you can jump in your car in the centre of Brisbane and drive all the way to the Gold Coast and not miss out. All you see is buildings. Our plan is to ensure that people do have a green welcome or green departure, depending on which way they're going.
So we've got one quite topical question left, and I think given that we're actually running well on schedule, we can ask this question and then comments, and then maybe give each of the candidates the opportunity to close with maybe some closing statements of questions that maybe they'd like to answer that haven't been asked. This question relates specifically to the Coles property, the Coles development. So the Coles, and I'll read it out for the context of the audience. The Coles Property Development Group have an application currently lodged with Council for a full-size supermarket, petrol station, 2 takeaway outlets, gymnasium and a warehouse, potentially the size of Bunnings. The application is in conflict with the Sunshine Coast's planning scheme, and in particular the supermarket, which is retail. In the planning scheme, we understand retail is applied west of Steve Irwin Way and industrial to the east to protect both and keep separated. The land is on the corner of Steve Irwin Way and Roy's Road, Beerwah, and the proposal is to change just over 11 hectares of industrial land and change the zoning to suit the expanded future master plan development. So the question in that context is, what are your thoughts on this proposal to change the planning scheme to suit the development without going through an amendment to the planning scheme review in consultation with state government, Sunshine Coast Council, business and community? And secondly, is the Sunshine Coast planning scheme a document business and community can trust to invest time and money into, or can the rules change depending on the size of the developer? So that is the questions.
No one wants to answer that one.
Oh, I get a first chance. All right, I'll go for it. I'll make some notes on this one. Thank you. Okay. 11 hectares isn't a huge site, but by the same token, it's placed in an area that, as we understand it from the information, is designated to be for industrial. If you look at Moroni Place and the other areas here, you'll see there's a couple of tilt-up buildings on one side, there's now some tilt-up buildings on the other. I've seen that take 20 years, is the truth. I can't see much more industrial buildings making their way to Roy's Road in another 10, 15 years, simply based on demand, based on the number of industrial or commercial operations that are going to want to construct and work there. So I find it odd that you would want to place a retail outlet in that location. One of the key things that I noted in relation to this when I was preparing was that, and notwithstanding that you've already got some industrialisation on the other side, you know, you've got Barry Gray's buildings, you've got a few other buildings tucked in there as well already. So the fragmentation has already sort of happened, but we are going through a period of a reconcentration in this particular location of industrial, and therefore it does afford an opportunity to make the distinction and to keep yourself with a proper retail precinct. And the simple reality is that if something is constructed there in this manner, perhaps other than a servo, really what you're achieving is further fragmentation. And that further fragmentation can only have an underlying impact on the strip shops, for example, not just the centres, but all of, you know, the Aldi through all of those individual shops. And the reality here right at the moment is I dropped into IGA to pick up some water and CJ's Donuts was closed and is gone, shut down. Now, so does that not tell you that there are already some issues to be dealt with in terms of demand? Is there a demand for the construction of this thing that is proposed? And the reality is Bunnings is a category killer. You've got two wonderful businesses here that operate, the co-op, and you've got the Glasshouse co-op, and they'll be rooted if Bunnings is built. Okay, simple. There you go.
Might have been a technical term. I think it's worth just taking a step back. In the last 2 terms of council, we've seen some significant development go on in Beerwah, and an upgrade of the town centre. So significant opportunity for people in a growing area like this to be able to go and do their shopping. And I also would like to put in a plug for Development I. How many of you are familiar with Development I? okay, please take the time to go onto Council's website and have a look at Development Eye. It will enable you to be up to the minute on every development application that's in front of Council, irrespective of what it is. And you can even put your own personal information in about what you'd like to know, i.e., can you tell me about anything that's going on within 100 metres of my address? Or, you know, tell me how many childcare centres might be opening up. Well, I'll get back to this topic in a moment, but so you should go and use that. People talk about transparency. This is a nation-leading app that is not available in any other council in the country, developed by the Sunshine Coast Council, where you can go and find out everything you need to know. So before you start criticising council about being transparent, go and have a really good look at that if you're really interested in development. Back to this particular development. All the details of this shopping centre development are on Development Eye. I'm also aware that it's currently at an information request stage, and given the application is current, I really need to be careful about the opinion I exercise, given that it could be interpreted as me seeking to influence the outcome. And I'm serious about that. I'm aware that the site is currently zoned for industrial use and well outside the centre zone for Beerwah, making it well outside the planning scheme. So I've every confidence that the council staff will assess the application thoroughly and robustly. Thank you.
I thought you'd already spoken.
To me, this is really about trust. Who can you trust to stand by the council's planning scheme? We've seen a number of instances where the council have overridden the planning scheme, moved amendments to it against the wishes of a local community. Something like this development will have a devastating impact on existing businesses within the town centre and other shopping centres close by. My own personal view is I don't think we need a Bunnings, Coles, Woolworths on every corner. We just don't need it. As I said before, I'm really about supporting local businesses and mums and dads' businesses and giving them the opportunity to scale up their business. The council shouldn't approve something that's outside the town plan without engaging with the local community first. And if there's a desire amongst the local community to move a planning scheme amendment, then the council needs to take that route. But they've got to listen to the local community and engage with them properly first.
Just one question for the Mayor. Development Eye doesn't have anything about the CBD, does it?
It has information on the CBD, yes.
Oh, I looked it up. Anyway, the first question I believe that should be asked about a development or a similar development to what we're talking about is what market is there? I mean, okay, Beerwah has got 7,500 people. It's not a large market, and I guess if you look at average household expenditure, there's about $26 million spent here a year on groceries, not including liquor or maybe cigarettes. So that sort of comes down to about 60 jobs. So isn't 60 jobs probably taken up within the current Beerwah shopping centre? I mean, is there enough then to start another shopping centre somewhere else? Because in my view, that would be the first consideration before you even started talking about whether or not conforms to the town plan. Because there's a great deal of approval of more and more retail outlets that are competing with existing retail outlets. For example, they approved 5 fast food outlets in Sippy Downs that obviously impacted on all the local takeaways and food retailers. So you can't just say that any approval exists in a vacuum like they do with, they say this is a development and therefore it exists in a vacuum and we'll consider it. It must be considered in relationship to the local economy and the impact it will have on that. So that's what I think is a very important consideration that isn't being considered by the council. And at the moment we have, I think, maybe 8 fast food outlets being approved or built along, they're already been approved, along the Nicklin Way, one which is at the entrance of a single lane road that goes around and passes a state school and a state college and the local swimming pool. And this is guaranteed to cause a traffic jam. But because the kids want to go there before school, they want to go there after school, but this is not considered. So, anyway, as I say, my principal concern would be what's the market and can it stand another, is there enough fat in the local economy to support a whole new complex? I don't think there would be in Beerwah.
So in the time that we've got, we might just allow each of the 4 candidates just to make some closing comments or statements. I think in fairness, we'll go in reverse order to the opening statements. So Don, that might put you up first.
So I mentioned earlier that I want to make sure that things are about ideas. So to be a person that fulfills this role, I don't just want to bring ideas, but I want to have some forward planning attached to that. So we've been discussing issues of concentration of populace. We've been discussing issues around the significant expansion that Aura, for example, represents in relation to this community, and it is proximate to this community, as equally perhaps is Harmony, and also a significant populace increase. To me, the idea of looking forwards is that I see the completion of Aura as a catalyst for de-amalgamation. I think it's fairly obvious that by the time Aura is constructed, that it will be time for Caloundra City to regain its identity back and cut itself free from Maroochydore. Okay, simple as that. I just think the numbers will be there. I think it will be possible to make it happen readily, and it may even be that that is the time for that continuation of the ongoing discussion about separating off and having the Hinterland Shire. Okay, so those are things that to me are realistic, sensible, and a consequence of long-term growth and long-term planning. I would like to add one other separate thing that I want to do, and I read an article in the Australian because I had to go down to Brisbane and to the Gold Coast for a family wedding, and it was a lovely story. I wish I could remember the chap's name, which seems silly because he's a billionaire, but he's the person who has bought stockland, and so he ultimately now is the person who is developing Aura. Now, what he just did during the bushfires down in New South Wales was save a whole town from fire. Because he has an equestrian centre there, he set in place a number of sensible and careful measures to ensure that it was protected against the fires, and in fact, nothing burned, everybody was saved, all stock was saved, nothing was lost. So it's my idea simply to write to him and say, well, give Aura that safety. Simple as that, okay? It should have exits. It should not be one way. It's treacherous. And if he is that cognizant of where he lives and his ponies, then I'd like to think that he's cognizant of protecting his investment in that community. And I would have expected some advocacy from Mark on this point, because he should have already been onto him and he should have already been saying to him, mate, this looks like a disaster here if anything gets going. So how about you prioritise the access through to Bells Creek and make sure everyone can see what a good bloke you are. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, to me it's all about the economy and jobs. We aren't in, no matter how much we want to protest and whatever we want to say, we're not in control of population growth. You know, the Aura is a proof of the fact that we're not. I mean, the council resisted Aura for many, many years, and in the end, state government simply approved it, and now we've got 50,000 extra people. So they can do that similar or they can take similar action, whatever, whenever they feel like it. I mean, there's a great, anyway. So what we have to do, or what the council has to do, is put in place policies and agendas that will create employment here. Because, as I say, we have to be able to give jobs to the people that come here. We can't say, oh, we're going to control population. And the other thing is, if people come here without a job, their contribution to the economy is minimal. Because if they're existing on federal government subsidies or support, they have very little disposable income and therefore contribute very little other than shopping at the supermarket that's not locally owned anyway, and they have very little to spend in local business. So unless we create jobs, we won't have a population that is capable of spending in local business. And local business, the 32,000 of them, create all local jobs. You know, it's not the large project that you know, boasts of their 200 million, which is mainly extracted from the region. It's the down-to-earth 32,000 local businesses that create the jobs. Now, although we speak of 6% unemployment, we have, in fact, a hole in our population from 15 to 49 of 15%. That is, we have 15% less people in that prime working age group than we should expect. And also we have a distorted amount of, the normal across the nation employment percentage in construction is 11%, and we have about 17%. Because the only jobs that, or virtually the only jobs other than the hospital and some education jobs that have been created in the last 8 years were in construction. So that in the end is what we have to do. We have to create jobs. The council, increasingly around the world, local government is taking a hand in being the interface between the community and business in creating local industry. It doesn't become the risk taker, but it becomes a facilitator. I mean, we've taken enormous risks with the airport. We're taking enormous risks with the CBD, and we're taking more risks with the cable, and now they're speaking of this light rail. And although they say it won't be paid for by the ratepayers, in fact, I believe that the Gold Coast the ratepayers of the Gold Coast subsidise their light rail for about 30 million a year. So our light rail will be longer than the initial one was on the Gold Coast. It passes through less dense suburbs, so there's a pretty good probability that we'll be paying a higher subsidy than the Gold Coast ratepayers.
Chris.
Thanks, Brett. Let me close this evening by saying thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this evening. I'm surprised so many of you have stayed for so long. I've nearly walked out myself once or twice. But anyway, I particularly wanted tonight to acknowledge all of our divisional candidates that we've got here this evening as well. I feel really privileged that we live in a community where so many good people want to put up their hands to represent the best interests of the community. I think everyone needs to acknowledge that this evening. In the future, I've made a couple of statements about what I would do if I was mayor. Firstly, I will open up the council to be more honest, open and transparent. Secondly, we will make decisions based on enhancing the lifestyle of the people of the Sunshine Coast. Folks, I'm someone you can trust to lead the council into the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And again, to the audience here tonight, and to Ursula in particular for putting this evening on. Hopefully you've found it valuable. Perhaps those people who are here as candidates for other divisions, it's an opportunity for you to get some insights into what's going on. I'm a very optimistic person, and I unfortunately sense a sense of negativity from some of my competitors who seem to want to talk everything down and it's ain't it bad and ain't it awful. Chris, you might like to check how many times you voted to go into confidential session, because I don't think there was one time you didn't vote. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. The reality is you go into confidential session to deal with really sensitive issues, like what would be the point of sitting there having a conversation amongst councillors if the developer and the opponents and the lawyers are all in the room? All we're going to do is prejudice the position of our ratepayers. It's an absolute nonsense. I mean, how do we deal with critical things around the airport? I mean, it was mentioned, what a brilliant asset we've got for our region. But the papers tried to tear us to shreds because we wouldn't tell them how much we were prepared to spend on the development. Well, because if we did, that's where the price would start in terms of the people bidding for it. So I think we've been very, very sensible in the money we've been able to save for our ratepayers. I see myself as a servant leader. I want to serve the community, but I also want to lead from the front in terms of what needs to be done. And when I came into office in 2012, there was a hell of a lot that needed to be done. Council had sat on its hands for a long time and not done much at all. Since then, we have had real action around the development of the airport, real action around the development of the CBD. You need to think seriously about the importance of that CBD to the entire Sunshine Coast in the future. There's 600 kilometres, 580 kilometres of dirt road in our hinterland. Rates coming out of that CBD in the future will be one really sure way that we'll see more of those roads sealed over time. That's going to be a really important part of our region. And I also want to talk about some of the things that Council has done in the sports and creative area in particular. I mean, how great is it to have the Sunshine Coast Lightning as our home team, the first ever national team in a national sports competition, a female team representing the Sunshine Coast. I mean, they're the sort of things that Council has been doing to demonstrate how important it is to set good examples for young people. I could go on for another 5 minutes with all the time these other roosters have had tonight, but I won't. I'll just wrap up by saying again, thank you very much. And if you want the success of the Sunshine Coast to continue, please consider voting for me. Thank you.
Well done, Mark.
Okay, Michael, Chris, Mark, Don, thank you. I appreciate the time you've taken, and on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce as well. It's terrifically informative to have you out here so that we can understand your position. Look, to the broader community, if there are questions particularly relating to the commercial or matters relating to commerce that you feel like you would like to siphon through the Chamber, I think that's a really good opportunity for us to consolidate a voice. But it's terrific food for thought on the position that the four of you propose to take. Ursula, I think we've got some wine, maybe? We do. Just a little thank you from us for taking the time. I don't know whether you can accept these or not, but we'll see.
I can. So wrap of mine for the benefit of
I wasn't sure. But anyway, thank you, and I think a round of applause for the candidates.